you have your question sheets, grab those. I want to look at the questions for chapter 8. We'll use that to review chapter 8, and then we'll move into chapter 9 this evening together. So if you have your question sheets, grab those. Let's look at questions for chapter 8, and then we will answer those and then move into the questions, or rather the study of chapter 9 together this evening. As you recall, you have had a succession of seals that have been opened. We had an interlude period, and then we began the process of seeing what this seventh seal revealed, and then there are these first four trumpeters that you dealt with here in chapter 8 that we saw. And so question A says, when the seventh seal was opened, there followed a what? A silence. We talked about that kind of is contrasting that many times we've seen thus far in the pictures around the throne, praise and worship. But when this seventh seal was opened, a period of silence, a pause, if you will, in relationship to all those things. And then the seven angels and the seven trumpets, like the seven churches of Asia, the seven horns, the seven eyes, the seven spirits. That's a number we've seen repeatedly throughout the text. Would you take that to mean exactly a literal number, fullness, completeness, or a lucky number? Yeah, we've talked about it, that's the fullness and completeness, a perfection number that we've seen repeatedly throughout the narrative. When the fifth seal was opened, the souls under the altar cried, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth?" Now in this heavenly scene, much incense was added to the prayers of all the saints. Is that true or false? I believe those statements are true in relationship to that conversation. Who makes intercession for the saints? Okay, Jesus does, and we can also add, particularly out of Romans 8, the Holy Spirit as well involved in that. The involvement of Jesus and the Holy Spirit, both making proclamations before the throne of God in relationship or on behalf of the saints. The implication seemingly in the book of Revelation is more to impress upon the hearer that your prayers aren't being wasted. That the vision reminds them that those prayers are being heard and that they're getting to the Father. And that really, to me, is the biggest impression we should get out of all these symbols and pictures. That though it may seem to them, because the persecution's continuing, the challenges are continuing, the difficulties are continuing, that maybe God's not even listening to me anymore. But the implication of this vision to me, most importantly, is a recognition that what's being prayed is making it to God the Father. They just need a little patience and time before He'll address the oppressors that are challenging them. In answer to the saints' prayers, the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and threw it to the earth. Describe the result. Okay. All kinds of calamities were reacted to in relationship to that. Incense was used by the Aaronic priesthood in the worship of God. That's true. You can see that in a couple of different texts that incense was used. And we reference that simply from the idea that when he talks about this imagery of this incense before the throne of God, it's not foreign imagery. Something they've seen before in those Old Testament times, so they'd be able to make a pretty easy connection to the implications of it. Question G. Trumpets were used in the Old Testament and in the New Testament to call people to convocation, sound an alarm, announce coming judgment, to warn, to announce a final judgment. Yeah, I believe you probably see all of those at one point or another where trumpets are used for those purposes. Yeah. You're going to ask me too quick because I didn't mark them. Yeah, let me go back and look. I don't want to spin my wheels here. I'll have to go back. I didn't mark my notes on this. Yeah, I'll check with you on later. But I'm pretty confident that all of those are correct. But I'll come back and look at it. When the first angel sounded, what happened? Okay, hail and fire followed, mingled with blood. And they were thrown to the what? To the earth. Why that keeps being repeated, by the way, is when he's talking about these judgments and things that he's talking about, this vision that he sees, all of these things are earthly judgments. He's bringing consequence and challenge and difficulty to earthly judgment. Not that spiritual judgment that comes at the end of times where he separates the sheep from the goat in heaven and hell and that conversation of judgment. Every single one of these is about what's being hurled towards the earth. Consequences and judgments against those oppressors on the earth. And that's key in our understanding of the book of Revelation. A third of the what? Trees and all grass at this stage, at least in this conversation, was burned up. What effect does the shedding of blood have upon the land? Okay, it defiles it. And interestingly, from that same text, what's the only thing that can cleanse it? The blood of whom? Yeah, the one who caused it. Yeah, the blood of the one who caused the problem to begin with. In that imagery of Numbers chapter 35, 33, the blood of the oppressor is the one who is the only blood that could cleanse the blood of that had been shed upon that land. What's interesting is that's a principle under that Old Testament system and Old Testament times that holds true. What's the changing factor in the New Testament? The blood of the Lamb, right? We've seen that throughout this narrative. The blood of the Lamb changes that whole picture. No longer does the blood of the oppressor or the sinful one, in a sense, the blood of the Lamb can bring cleansing to sin if men will come to Him. But God's judgment is still being met against those who oppress and challenge people. The second trumpet, when the second angel sounded, something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood. A third of the creatures, right? I thought you said preachers. You scare me to death. A third of the creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships, okay? All again, these earthly challenges, judgments that he's bringing. Old Testament prophets sometimes use mountain to symbolize a world kingdom. True. We talked a little bit about that on Sunday. When the third angel sounded, there fell from heaven a great star, burning like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers, okay? Okay. Springs of water, or fountains of water, depending on what your translation. The name of the star is wormwood. Wormwood means bitter. So a third of the waters became wormwood or bitter, and many men died from the water because it was bitter. Turning to idols is compared to a root bearing and so poison, bitterness, depending on your translation, you would see various descriptions in Deuteronomy 29. When the fourth angel sounded, a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, and a third of the day did not shine, and likewise the night. That's an N, not an M. Old Testament prophets used the withholding of light to represent judgment. That's true. We see those references to darkness repeatedly. Who is the light of men? Jesus or Christ is the light of men. And wisdom comes from God. The four trumpets which sounded seemed to call for reformation. Think that's true or false? You think it's true? What are they reforming? Okay. Okay. And so the oppressors. Okay. So attempt to reform the oppressors. Uh, anyone else think differently? Did everybody answer true? Nobody wants to take a chance? I can see it in your eyes. You're like, maybe I put false, but I'm not saying it. I'll tell you, and maybe I misread this question, and maybe I'm not thinking about it right, and that's perfectly possible. What my mind thought of when I think of Reformation, I think of change. I think of, but it seems like when this judgment comes, the opportunity of that has passed. And that's why I felt like maybe these judgments were more about avenging the blood of the oppressed than it was about changing the people. But I will also argue, though, and maybe we'll just circle the center of the two. Do one of these. Remember these when you were in school? Praying she wouldn't notice. But because there is some level of repentance under discussion when you read chapter 9 and you get to verses 20 and 21, and there may have been something, I believe, that the writer of the workbook wrote that might have led you to also make those same conclusions. And so if you were feeding off of what the writer of the workbook, I think he did lean towards true in relationship to that. And so if you were reading his thoughts, I understand how you would answer true because he led you there in his discussions. And so yeah, and so I, depending on how you want to look at it, I felt that question may have leaned either way. Who announced the three woes? And another one actually, other than what they had seen. To whom are they directed? Inhabitants of the earth. Again, earthly judgment. This isn't spiritual judgment where we distinguish those who are going to heaven and hell. These judgments under discussion are towards the earth. Fire from the altar thrown towards the earth. Judgment to the earth, to the earth, to the earth. Over and over and over and over again in this context. So we're talking about, and in the context of the earlier statements of the prayers going before the Father from the saints and the blood that was of the souls that was under the altar, and that whole conversation of how long, Lord, will you sit back and watch this oppression happen and not do and not resolve it? And so this is about God bringing judgment against those who were oppressing His people. Any thoughts or questions about chapter 8? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we're envisioning a winged angel grabbing fire and flinging it at us. And that's the truth. That's the problem we have. Is we can't get past the imagery to see the picture, and the specific nature of the imagery, to see really just a very powerful imagery representing the powerful nature of when God brings judgment against certain things. Yeah, and I agree with that, and that's something Bob has brought up before in our study as well. That keep in mind the imagery is somewhat intended so that if this message is seen by someone from the Roman government, they're going to look at that and go, "Well, I don't think I'm going to worry about supposed scorpion-tailed locust," and right, that would be their reaction to that. Whereas the imagery would settle in with them better. Go ahead, Mom. Yeah. 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 And these things would take time. This is probably, and I didn't intend to do this, obviously, I was able to pull it up quickly on the screen. But that leads me into something I wanted to do tonight, very briefly. And that is just walk through Roman history with you for a minute. And because we've been applying this to the Roman Empire, and we've been talking about how these pictures fit some of the historical things as it relates to that empire. So let's just look for a minute at a couple of these things, and I say a brief historical timeline of this. You see the destruction of Jerusalem and the building of the Colosseum roughly in that time period of 69 to 96 AD. From 96, and now you're right at the right at that same end of that time period is when John writes this epistle, this letter to the seven churches of Asia, and so you're kind of at the beginning point here. From 96 to 192, the Pantheon is built, but they begin to see plague disruptions in the normal life in Rome. So it's not long after John writes the letter that they begin to see some of the very calamities and natural events that are challenging Rome. It's not a long stretch of time after he writes this that they start seeing it. From 193 to 235, the Severan dynasty ruled, but also brought the close of Pax Romana, or Roman peace. So you're starting to see inward turmoil begin to be built. And 235 to 284 marked a 50-year period of war, plague, famine, bloodshed, all the kinds of things that we're talking about in this judgment that is coming. You begin to see it all. And we're not talking about centuries and centuries later. We're talking within the first within the first few decades, you see the beginnings of the judgment, and then it just progressively continues in its challenge towards them. From 238 to 268, they had internal issues: high taxes, failing economy, government instability, foreign invasions. Every empire or nation that has falls generally because it weakened itself first. The foreign invasion is able to happen most often throughout history against nations because those nations weakened themselves internally first. They were right for the challenge. And so Rome was that way. It had created its own set of challenges, made itself very vulnerable to foreign challenges that may come. From 268 to 285, a resurgence of persecution. And so you had maybe a lull in it, but it comes back. And then from 285 to 364, greater cooperation from Constantine. Roman Catholicism is beginning to take root as it begins to try to build bridges between civil government and itself. And you see really the beginnings of Roman Catholicism really taking root in those days. And then from 364 to 476, the Visigoths and Vandals bombard Rome to ultimately its ultimate ruin. And so that Roman Empire saw the seeds of its destruction happening in the very early stages shortly after John sends this revelation. And over a period of time, one by one, they create greater and more difficult calamities till their very end in relationship to those things. And so I just wanted to share that with you. And again, that's very brief and undetailed. But just to show that when we talk about how Rome had challenged and oppressed God's people, And that this judgment very well be discussing judgments against them because of that. You can kind of see that happening in their history as you begin to look at that history unfold. And so it's not unfounded, I guess, is the point we're trying to make. All right, chapter 9. Yes, go ahead. Okay, so Leviticus 23:24 to the answer to your question. Leviticus 23:24. Thank you. All right, chapter 9. So, had the first 4 sound, and now the 5th angel sounded. And I'll warn you ahead. The longer I looked at this, the more I felt that this needs to be looked at big picture. And so if you hear me read chunks, it's for a reason. Because I think if we go way too slow in these verses, we're gonna nitpick and try to figure out so much of the detail that we'll miss really what's happening. But let me show you what I believe is key to chapter 9. It's an odd way to do this. Go to the end. Go to the very end of the chapter, and I'll show it to you on the screen. Go to chapter 9, verse 20. Understand this, and then let's go back and look at what he talks about. Verse 20. And the rest of the men which were not killed by these plagues. All right. So just that statement alone tells you that what kind of judgment are we talking about? Earthly, and is it overwhelming or limited? It's limited, right? So we're not talking about final judgment here in this text. This narrative is not about end times. This is not about the second coming of Jesus where people are judged and eternal conditions are set. Because there are going to be a handful of men who are able to survive. There's going to be a handful of men who are going to be able to survive all of these calamities that he talks about in this chapter. These plagues, but here's the key. They went through it all, yet they didn't what? Yet repented not of the works of their hands, that they should not worship devils and idols of gold and silver and brass and stone and of wood, which neither can see, nor hear, nor walk. Neither repented they of their murders, nor of their sorceries, nor of their fornication, nor of their thefts. What I want us to appreciate from the end of this chapter is God sent all of this stuff that we're going to read about. Various types, kinds, from natural calamities to foreign nations, to internal struggles like high taxes and tumult among the people. That all of these things struck. And some men still what? Still haven't learned anything. And that hasn't changed a bit. We will witness all kinds of struggles, difficulties, judgments, challenges, things that people, and for some, it just doesn't change them. They never turn aside. And so, whatever we're talking about in verses 1 through 19, there are survivors. And there are no survivors, if you will, in that context of thought. When it comes to God's final judgment, every knee shall bow, every tongue shall confess. So whatever's under discussion isn't about eternity, heaven and hell, spiritual condemnation or spiritual reward at the end. It's about what's happening and judgments upon the earth. Now go back. And let's look at these pictures. So the 5th angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth. And to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit, out of the smoke of a great furnace. And the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power as the scorpions of the earth have power. And it was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, neither any green thing, neither any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. So don't get lost in the picture. God's bringing a judgment, and at this particular moment, it's a judgment against men. Right? That's what he said. That's the most specific part of it, and that's the part. Whatever this is, okay? We're going to talk more before we're done about what possibly the star could be, and we're going to give I think a name for it later in the text, and we can draw some reasonable conclusions about those things. But ultimately, the point is that God's bringing a judgment. And He's bringing a judgment against men, and there's plenty of power and resources available to Him to accomplish that. He can turn locusts into scorpion-like creatures and set them loose. But notice, here's the key. There came out of the locust upon the earth, and unto them was given power as the scorpions of the earth. But notice verse 4. And it was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass of the earth. So, is this just an uncontrollable force that's just going to go crazy? No. God is using anything that He chooses to use that's at His power and disposal, and He's in control of it the whole time. This is not an uncontrollable force that He just turns loose to wreak whatever havoc it may. Because when you think of locusts, you think of something that's controllable? And generally not, right? You think of the exact opposite. You think of something that's uncontrollable. Something that so that's why don't have in your head little bugs, okay? And big stingers on them, and heads like men, and hair like women, and that's what he's going to say here in a little bit. All right? Just think about God's power to bring judgment. And all of that judgment is within His control. He can decide to what severity, to whom it affects. Remember, we had the interlude. Go do what? Go mark them, right? Go mark the faithful. Go identify the faithful upon their foreheads. So that when I bring my judgment, we will have sealed them. We will have identified them. And when I bring this judgment, I can secure them. This isn't just an out-of-control judgment. It's a judgment fully within the control of what God desires to happen in relationship to it, even to certain limitations. To them it was given, verse 5, that they should not kill them, but they should be tormented 5 months, and their torment was as the torment of a scorpion when he striketh a man. Pictures, okay? Pictures. 5 months, all kinds of things you could read about that. Most say that they used that imagery because that was the general length of time that a locust swarm would generally, the period of time that it would take for them to eventually do their deed. And so it was common to think about a 5-month stretch when you think of a locust plague. But I don't know that he's attempting to give any kind of specific time frame. He's just talking about a limited time frame. Not an eternal time frame. This isn't a forever circumstance, but something that would be limited. And what's interesting is, let's add verse 6. And in those days shall men seek death, and shall not what? Shall not find it, and shall desire to die, and death shall flee from them. Well, I suppose if, for picture's sake for a moment, that I wake up every day being stung by locust-like scorpions, I'd probably just rather die, right? I'd rather die than have the misery of a daily regiment of being tormented by this challenge. That's what he's saying. The difficulties will be so harmful and so acute and so challenging that men would just assume that they die from the scorpion sting. But it's more tormenting than that, more challenging than that when they striketh a man. And in those days shall men seek death, shall not find it, shall desire to die, and death shall flee from them. And the shapes of the locusts were like unto horses, prepared unto battle. And on their heads were as it were crowns like gold. Their faces were as the faces of men. And they had hair as the hair of women. Their teeth were as the teeth of lions. Well, maybe I'm completely wrong in my simple conclusion here. But in some ways, what I appreciate about what this, as John sees this vision and as he writes it down for us, is it is so outrageous that you can't help but say to yourself, he's got to be talking in figures and pictures and symbols and signs. No other common sense conclusion, in my humble opinion, could be made when you see the kind of description that he's giving here of a locust that looks like a horse, the face of a man, the hair of a woman, the teeth of a lion. Everything that is necessary to produce the judgment and condemnation that God is bringing is at its disposal. And in its own tremendously odd, descriptive way, he's simply illustrating to us an overwhelming power that they could not handle or be able to overcome. I'll breathe. Yeah. And you don't know what form it may be in at any particular time. One minute it might be a natural phenomenon like locusts. It might be the challenge of a scorpion sting. It might be men fighting one another. It could be women within. It can be anything. It could be anything that God is using to bring these judgments against the oppressors, which is back to chapter 5 is the picture here. Yeah, and well, it can have all kinds of pictures, and that's why I'm not trying to, throw some kind of specificity to it, because he doesn't. He uses so many different descriptions of the same creature, if you will, or the same picture. That just whatever, it can come in all kinds of forms, types, but certainly God's destruction is overwhelming. And though at this point in time, it's more of a torment than it is an overwhelming destruction, because men are surviving at this point in relationship to this first woe. Remember, at the end of chapter 8, 3 more woes are coming. And so they had these tails like unto scorpions. There were stings in their tails, and their power was to hurt men 5 months. Again, that same imagery. And they had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue hath his name Apollyon, destroyer. It means destroyer or destructor. Who do you think of? Satan. That's who I think of in relationship to this. Notice he said, generally when you see a locust swarm, they don't have any leader. No one's going, hey boys, let's go over here to this vegetation. All right now fellows, let's run over here to this vegetation, right? They don't have any leader. They just go. But this isn't a locust swarm in its literal sense. This effort to bring challenge has guidance behind it, leadership behind it. And if we're right in concluding, and again, I'm willing to be wrong in some of the pictures, but if Satan is the picture, and he's been released, if you will, to open up this bottomless pit. We saw that key. The star comes down, the key to open the bottomless pit there in the earlier part of the chapter. To me, what I saw from that, if that is Satan, is that potentially Rome and well, I'll talk about something else here in a second. But potentially Rome has, for a period of time, gotten away with their oppression. That the consequence of their actions hasn't come to fruition. But finally a point comes where the pit is open, and all of this, in a sense, all of this contained difficulty and hardship that they have been producing eventually is just unlocked and unleashed upon them as the consequence of their sinful behaviors is finally being realized. And Satan is always behind that, anytime. Yeah. And Isaiah 14:12 is a perfect parallel to the same kinds of language that we're seeing here in this picture. And I think it's a fair conclusion to make that you're dealing with Satan here as the one who is given the ability to bring this destruction and consequence, as he's behind all sin. Yeah, right. All that he brings to bear in relationship to it. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. And you see again the star, the lightning bolt. This imagery is very connected, obviously, in that destructor mode as well. Yep. Go ahead. Yeah. 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 And some of that could be. And the thing about what's hard to see about some of that is that they would begin to see some of these things unfold. They'd have a better understanding of when, oh, okay, I remember that picture. I remember that vision. But because all this stuff is past history to us, it's harder for us to see the same unfolding of those events. So one woe is past, verse 12. And behold, there come two woes more after. And the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar which is before God, saying to the sixth angel which had the trumpet, loose the four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. Now, my conclusion is you're dealing with four different angels here at Euphrates, and not the same that were at, if you recall, that had been withheld earlier at the four corners. I believe you're probably dealing with a different set in the vision. But be that as it may, there's four angels, and they're at the bound at the great river Euphrates, which was generally thought as the northern boundary of what? Of Israel, right? Of that northern area. It's the northern boundary. When God would refer to that northern boundary, He would refer to Euphrates in order to mark that. And so it's a common phrase. Again, whether He's dealing literal here, but it's a concept they would have understood, that here's these boundaries in which God had devised, and He'd been holding back this judgment, but He's going to turn it loose in verse 15. The four angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year, for to slay the third part of men. Torment in the first woe, men are going to be slain in the second woe that's being spoken here out of the sixth trumpet. And so this and an hour, a day, a month, a year, they were prepared. To me, what that simply means is that this isn't some afterthought. This isn't some God up and decided one day, you know what, I'm going to send judgment down there, and I'm going to slay. This isn't something that He just out of the blue decided. These have been plans, purposes, functions that God had, a day, a month, a year. He's been preparing for. And now it's going to be unleashed. It's going to be loosed. And the number of the army of the horsemen were 200,000, and I heard the number of them. And thus I saw the horses in the vision, and them that sat on them, having breastplates of fire, and of jacinth and brimstone, and the heads of the horses were as the heads of lions, and out of their mouths issued fire and smoke and brimstone. Pretty severe kind of judgment God's bringing. That is going to bring powerful judgment against men. Beyond just the torment that they had experienced under the initial woe of chapter 9. But now to mount to now an even greater degree. There are some, by the way, that point to the fact that when you think of locusts, scorpions, these elements are generally thought of as oriental. They're generally thought of as elements that involve the East. And so there are some who argue that your initial judgment comes towards those at Rome. But that isn't limited to Rome, that as these extra woes begin to be put forth by Jehovah, that they may also involve portions of the eastern world at that time and affect them. And that's why he uses symbols like locusts and scorpions and things that would have been relevant to the Orient more than it would have been to Rome. And so that's fair. I don't know that I could make an argument one way or other in relationship to it, but I believe it's fair to consider anyway that we're not dealing just with Rome, that God's judgments fall upon more than just one empire that might be oppressive. If there are conflicts and challenges that God sees a need to address in other regions, He could accomplish that as well. And so, again, verse 18, but these three was the third part of men killed by the fire, and by the smoke, and by the brimstone, which issued out of their mouths. For their power is in their mouth, and in their tails. For their tails were like unto serpents, and had heads, and with them they do hurt. It sounds like something you wouldn't want to run into, doesn't it? I mean, yeah. 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 Right. And that's why I referenced the idea that maybe some of this does refer to more Oriental connections and not just Rome, because it does seem potentially larger, and not necessarily that those numbers are specific, but it does imply a large number of people. And he says the third part of men were killed by the fire and by the smoke here. Doesn't necessarily, I think, refer to the third part of men that were on the earth, but a third part of those who were present at the time of this judgment. And so it's pretty overwhelming. I mean, that's pretty sobering. A three, when the destruction comes, 1 out of 3 is lost. That's pretty sobering when you think about it, and the scale of that. Verse 20. Now back to what we said at the beginning of our study. And the rest of the men which were not killed by these plagues, yet repented not of the works of their hands, that they should not worship devils and idols of gold, and silver, and brass, and stone, and of wood, which neither can see, nor hear, nor walk. You would have hoped, and there's a sense I think that God would have hoped, that man would have envisioned these destructive elements, and those who survived it, that it would have changed them. You know, you talk sometimes to folks who have survived different things. You have read stories about people that have survived airplane crashes and things of that sort, and various things, and they talked about how it changed them. And you always wonder, for how long is somebody changed by an a circumstance like that. I can, the most vivid in my mind, and probably if you thought about it for a minute, in yours as well. September 11th, 2001. We all woke up that morning and saw things we never thought we would experience in our own country, right? And there were religious doors open across the country. And pews throughout the country were filled. For how long? It wasn't long, was it? The initial shock brought people to a spiritual awareness for the moment. Yeah, and that's right. No real. It scared a lot of people for the moment. But the moment things began in their minds to normalize, it didn't last long. For some. For most. There may be an exception here or there. Somebody whose thoughts processes changed, who began to refocus on things that really mattered, and I suppose it could have happened. But here's a group, these men have witnessed tremendous judgment, but didn't change them. And it not only didn't change them away from idolatry, but they were the same murderous, sorcerous, fornicating, thieving folks they had been before the judgment ever happened. It's amazing, isn't it? That people could experience such a thing and it not move them. And as sad as that is, there's a level of acceptance that I have learned to try to appreciate about that. Because I'm sure that all of us, at some point in time, have had a conversation with somebody and we have said, I don't know why they don't see it. How do they not see it? How do they not understand it? How do they not get it? That's been common to man for a long time. Some very open, specific things that ought to be turning the minds of people. It doesn't always do it. It's a shame, and consequence will come. But it happens, and it's always happened. Yeah, he kept saying. Yeah, if you'll respect what I'm saying, there's some change can take place. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's a sad reality, is that stiffened, hardened neck gets to a point where there's no remedy, no turning back. All right. So Lord willing, we'll come back Sunday. We'll answer questions to chapter 9. We'll jump into chapter 10. Look at chapters 10 and 11. Just spend some time in both chapters. They go a little hand in hand. And so just in case that I'm able to move into chapter 11 as well Sunday, just make sure you take a look at both of them.